The story or stories you are about to hear are to entertain. The writers of these stories may claim they are true, yet they may not be. That is up to you to decide. After all, this world is a strange one. They look like other things. They may take the form of animals, hybrids, and even people you know. We call them skinwalkers, and they are the stuff of nightmares. Enjoy these allegedly real encounters with skinwalkers, and be sure to send me your creepy creature sightings at darkstories.org. Creatures I've Seen in the Desert, Part 1, from Phillip S. It was during the summer of 2014. I was once again visiting my sister at her old house, a house in which I experienced some hauntings, but those are different stories. It took me a while to adjust being there, but as we began planning a camping excursion, I figured it would help me relax. We decided to go camping at a remote location a little over 45 minutes away from the town for a few days. It was a small forested area with a creek that runs through, which we camped next to. It was a very beautiful and peaceful place, but that would all soon change into horror, an experience that warped my mind. It happened on the first night at the campsite. My sister and I got into a sibling argument. Those with brothers and sisters would know what that's like. I don't even remember what we argued about. Probably over something dumb or stupid. I was still angry when everyone went to the tents to go to sleep, so I decided to go to bed in the truck. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling cold. I felt stupid over the fight, so I decided to go into the tent. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the truck door. As soon as I stepped 1 foot outside, I heard what sounded like sticks snapping. I looked up with the flashlight and saw what I thought was a deer about 15 feet away. This deer had yellow or light auburn, human-like eyes. Its back was arched, and its skin appeared to be sliding off of its body. Its feet were hooved, but it had hands in the front, human hands. The skin color on the hands were light brown. I mentioned that the deer portion of its body looked like it was about to come off, but after seeing those hands, I could now see that it looked more like this thing had skinned a deer and was now wearing the skin as a costume of some kind. It then started to stand up on its hind legs. This thing was so tall, like maybe above 8 feet. I'm a pretty short guy, only 5'4", so you can say this intimidated me. It then spoke without even moving its mouth, and somehow it knew my name. Phillip. I swear, somewhere in that voice, there was something familiar about it. Something like my sister's voice. I was absolutely terrified, scared beyond belief. I dipped out of the truck while slamming the door behind me. I crawled into the tent, and I lay down. I was shaking, crying from the fear. The slamming of the door had awakened my sister, and when she saw me, she asked if everything was okay, while still half asleep. Yes, I said to her, as normal-faced as I could, but that was obviously a lie. She didn't say anything else, then went back to sleep. But I could not. That voice was still in my head. Even typing this out, I remember the voice vividly. I did not see the thing for the rest of our stay, but I was still jumpy and on alert. When we went back to town, I talked with some of my native friends who are of Navajo descent about my experience. They say what I saw was probably a skinwalker, and I was lucky that I didn't try anything harmful. They think it was just trying to scare me away, maybe even get a kick out of freaking me out. Well, that worked like a charm, because I'm still scared. Creatures I've Seen in the Desert, Part 2, from Phillip S. This one happened in the summer of 2017. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and I was bored. I wanted to do something nice with my niece Chelsea and my two nephews Justin and Greg. I asked them if they wanted to take the buggy out to the desert and hunt coyotes and rabbits. They said yes, so I asked my sister if that would be okay. She said that would be fine, and handed me her 308 to take with me. We got in the buggy and drove off. We drove for about half an hour and stopped in an open field of nothing but desert, with mountains in the distance. We got out of the buggy and began to walk for a few minutes, with the 308 strapped to my back. As we were walking, Chelsea asked if we could stop and see if we could find anything. We did, and I began to scan the area. I stopped at one point because something weird caught my eye. It looked like a tall and skinny light black or perhaps dark gray rock on top of some other rocks. I remember saying, "That's a weird looking rock." The kids wanted to see too, so I helped them see down the scope of the rifle. When I showed Chelsea, she began to shake violently. I asked her why she was shaking like that, and what she told me gave me chills big time. "Uncle, I don't think that's a rock." I was so confused, I asked her what she meant. "It's moving." I looked through the scope myself. What I saw put me into protection mode. It was moving. Long and sickly skinny arms and legs stretched out like a person would do when they wake up. This thing was actually sitting or perhaps sleeping on a pair of rocks, and it appeared to have just awakened. It was just a few hundred yards away. I told them we needed to go back to the buggy. I would be right behind them. My nephews were confused, and Chelsea began to cry softly. She begged me to come with them. I looked at her and told her to go ahead, that I needed to keep an eye on this thing. I was so scared for us, honestly, but I had to protect them. I looked through the scope again. All my hair stood on end. I was beginning to shake. This thing was facing me. It was standing up. I think it knew we were watching it. Its face literally looked like one of those close-up views of the cat's face from the cartoon The Misadventures of Flapjack. Same eyes and teeth. It let out a loud shriek. This sounded primal, like a mixture of animal and man. It saw me. I was sure of it then, and it began to run towards us. I fired, the bullet simply knocking it down. It was already getting back up. I started to run. I saw the kids walking to the buggy, and I told them to run as well. We got in, and I drove fast, like a bat out of hell. We soon made it back to the house, and they ran out of the buggy while I sat there in the driveway contemplating what just happened. They kept asking me what happened and if I was okay. I didn't say anything. I simply got out and I hugged them while crying. I never thought something like this would actually charge me. I've seen weird crap, sure, but this felt different. My family had been in danger, and I felt at fault for it. I went inside the house and just dropped onto the couch. I didn't want to see that thing again, and if I did, I would have to try to destroy it. Camp Kanza Creature Attack, from Last Man Standing 55. I've gone camping many times within the middle of rural Kansas with my scout troop. This particular trip was set in the outskirts of Hutchinson in a camp called Camp Kanza. We'd left Friday night and arrived at around 11:30 at night. A couple of people had arrived earlier to set up camp, but when we got there was only one tent set up. So it would have to be about another hour until we could go to sleep. While we were setting up our own tents, the woods were oddly quiet, and only the wind could be heard among the treetops. Needless to say, we were on edge that night. Fortunately, that first night, nothing happened. It wasn't until the second night that things began to go down. For context, I was in a 4-man tent with 2 of my friends, Matthias and Nathaniel. We fell asleep around 10:30 and slept rather nicely before Nathaniel woke up Matthias. I was asleep for about the first third of the encounter. Nathaniel then told Matthias that he saw a huge shadow walk by and brush against the tent. Now you may ask how he saw the shadow, but it was extremely bright outside due to the moon being full. They then began discussing what it could have been, when then the tent on my side began to cave in. As soon as Matthias put his flashlight on the spot it was caving in from, they saw that something was pushing the tent in, and the flashlight caused it to back away. This caused me to wake up. Of course, I wanted to know what was going on, and they told me that something was touching the tent, pushing it down on my side, and it had actually reached my face. So now I'm getting extremely anxious when we hear a low snarl coming from outside the tent. We can hear it begin to circle us, and then we saw a silhouette when the figure passed between the moon and our tent. Whatever it was big. Thinking it was a person trying to mess with us, we yelled at them to screw off, but then it growled at us and tore claw marks into the side of the tent where the moon was, allowing us to get a clearer look at the thing. When I first saw it, it looked like a dark mass with 2 glowing yellow eyes, but then it stood up and did one of those sort of bark, growl mixed noises, and it started to push down on top of the tent again in an attempt to get us to run out of the tent, but we didn't. Call me cowardly or whatever, but I dove back into my sleeping bag. In hindsight, that probably wasn't a good idea and wouldn't help keeping it away from us. However, Matthias was calling his dad to get us out of here. As soon as he hung up the phone, everything stopped. The pushing, the growling, all of it just ceased. We stared at each other for about 5 minutes when Matthias's dad came to see what all the fuss was about. We came rushing out to him and begged him to take us home, but he said it was too late at night. We'd have to tough it out until morning at least. We all groaned at this. We decided to sleep in his truck for the night, throughout which we heard snarling and scratching noises around the truck, but eventually that stopped too. When things got quiet, I finally got some sleep. In the morning, we had gone back to the campsite and found our tent torn to shreds, but most of the items were still intact, except for Nathaniel's bag, which had food in it, which was now torn apart with food scraps all over the place. But one thing stood out the most. A freaking entire dead coyote had been thrown into the fire pit. Disgusted at the sight, we packed up whatever we could and silently drove back home, never speaking the whole way back. I'm still extremely scared of what happened. As a matter of fact, I'm writing this directly after I got home from this nightmare of a trip. I don't think I'll ever be camping in Kanza ever again. Who knows what's hiding in the shadows out there, waiting for night to fall to make itself a meal out of some campers. Possible Skinwalker, from Nessa. I grew up in a house that was tucked into the woods. We even had our own street name for our driveway. It was fairly secluded. Well, as kids, we grew up in the woods behind our house, because our favorite thing to do was play in the bluffs, dig caves. We would make our own clubhouses and climb trees from sunup to sundown. It was me, my 3 brothers, and my older sister. We hardly ever separated from each other, but on that day, my stepbrother decided he wanted to go home early to play Super Nintendo. We didn't think anything of it, really. We had just gotten the game system, and we fought over it constantly. So he took the opportunity to get it to himself. We told him to just be careful. The sun was setting at the time. About 15 minutes later, we hear a voice in the distance. It was faint at first, and it was coming from the opposite end of the woods that my brother left from. It suddenly became clear that it was his voice, but he was shrieking for help. And as the voice moved closer, we could make out words.
"Help me. It's me, Ryan."
We all looked at each other in disbelief, and something told us that this was not, in fact, Ryan. Must have been our immediate gut instinct. My older brother told us to run, now. We ran as fast as we could back to the house to get help. As soon as we got into the house, we saw our brother Ryan playing Super Nintendo, like he said he would. There was no possible way for him to beat us back to the house before we could get there, while yelling from the opposite direction into the woods. We were terrified and avoided going in the woods after that. That wasn't Isabella. From XX Dean XX. It was June 2019. Me and my best friends, Isabella and Elizabeth, were very close and still are today. I'd even say we're like sisters. The story I'm about to tell you was one of the most confusing yet scary experiences of my life. It was June, and school had just let out for the summer. All 3 of us girls were hanging out in Bella's room, talking about what we'd do for the summer. Bella and Liz lived in a more rural and secluded area, so their house was the only house for a while. Liz and Bella's parents were out of town at the time, and so their older sister, who we'll call Hannah, was watching over them. Hannah was out with her boyfriend, though, and wouldn't be back until late. We had a hard time trying to come up with ideas to keep ourselves entertained, so we decided to take a break, and we went downstairs to the living room to just watch TV. Bella was sitting on the couch watching The Vampire Diaries, while me and Liz were making something to eat for lunch. We were getting hungry. I think we decided on mac and cheese with turkey and cheese sandwiches. Around a crazy 4 hours later, after we had gotten bored of binging episode after episode, we went to the kitchen to clean up our mess, wash our dirty dishes and such. I told my friends I was a little tired, so I was going upstairs for a nap. They said okay, so I got a glass of water and headed upstairs to Bella's room to sleep. I fell asleep almost instantly. I was so tired from the lack of sleep I'd been having. It was 9:40 p.m. when I woke up to a slight knock on the bathroom from the level below me. Isabella's house was 3 stories, with her bedroom being a loft-type room, which made up the entire 3rd story. The 2nd floor, which was right below from the floor I was sleeping on, consisted of Liz and Bella's parents' room, Liz's room, and their bathroom, and finally the main floor, which was their living room, dining room, kitchen, laundry room, and 2nd bathroom. The knock that I heard woke me up from my nap, and I jumped up a little because the knock had frightened me. I think it was just because it was so sudden, and because I was tired. I then thought it was probably one of my friends, so I shrugged it off and got up off the futon to get a drink of my water, which was sitting on the dresser. Once that was done, I went to the bathroom. I walked downstairs to the 2nd level and slowly opened the bathroom door, still rubbing my eyes. I was still tired. I looked for the light switch and flipped it on so I could see. Then I used the restroom. After I got done, I walked over to the sink to wash my hands. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw a dark shape of what looked to be Bella. I was a bit creeped out, because she was just standing there in the dark hallway facing toward her sister Liz's room, not moving or speaking at all. I turned off the faucet, then I turned around to face my presumed friend. I began walking toward her. As I walked, I was still creeped out, but the only thing I could think was maybe she had fallen asleep downstairs and now was sleepwalking. I said to her in a soft and low voice, "Bella?" She turned her head toward me very awkwardly fast, and I immediately stopped walking. Now, I was a little more than just creeped out then. When I saw her face, I didn't see the face of my best friend, at least not the correct version of it. The face on this person had gaunt cheekbones with pale skin. The skin wasn't totally white, but extremely ghastly pale. The eyes were glowing yellow, and the face overall was just bony and taut. Its hair was all tangled and untidy, and way darker than Bella's hair. It starts to do this evil-looking smile at me. When I saw the teeth of it, they were disgustingly yellow and oddly sharp. Same for the nails on its hands. They weren't too long, but they were still yellow and pointed. I didn't know what this thing was supposed to be. This thing that was supposed to look like my best friend. Suddenly, it sort of skittered into Liz's room. I took the chance to sprint downstairs, yelling for the real versions of my friends. I run down into the living room, seeing the two sisters hop off the couch, running across the living room to me, wondering what in the world was wrong. I was so shaken up from what had happened that I couldn't speak, so Liz took me to sit on the couch to calm down, while Bella went to the phone in the hallway to call Hannah and tell her that something had happened. Liz leaves me on the couch to go to the fridge in the kitchen and gets me some orange Fanta with some ice. While all this is going on, I try to listen over the sounds of clinking glass cups to what Isabella is telling Hannah over the phone. I couldn't hear what she was saying, though. Liz rushed back into the living room and handed me the glass of soda, but I set it on the table. I almost spilt it because my hands were still so shaky. Bella comes hurrying back into the living room shortly after her sister. They were just sitting there looking at me. I assumed it was because they were waiting for me to tell them what happened. I began to explain what I saw upstairs, but they didn't believe me. They were trying to explain away why I would have seen something like that, like it could have been my clonidine. But I explained to them that in the 8 years I'd been taking those pills, I've never once had that kind of side effect. They ran out of logical explanations as to what it might have been, so they gave up and just kept telling me it wasn't real. Pretty soon, Hannah came flying through the door with her boyfriend and into the living room where we were. She asked what happened, and when I told her, she didn't seem to believe me either. But then she stood up from where she was kneeling in front of me and told me, "Hold on." She then took her boyfriend upstairs, and you could hear them walking around upstairs where Liz's room was. Shortly after, they came back down. Hannah came up to me and hugged me, saying it's okay. She pulled out her phone and said that it was late and time to go to bed. After what just happened, I didn't want to sleep at all. Hannah told us, "You girls can sleep on the couch if you want to, and we can sleep on air mattresses down here." We all agreed with Hannah's suggestion, and so we went and got everything set up. I fell asleep pretty fast. There weren't any more noises or anything like that the rest of the night. The next morning, I had Hannah drive me home because I didn't want to stay another night in that house. I've kept this experience to myself, and I haven't been back to their house ever since. I'm still close to Liz and Bella to this day, but we never talk about that night. I know they still don't believe me, and you might not either. but I'm still sharing my story because I know what I saw. I know that what I saw was not Isabella. Unexplained Creature in the Desert of Arizona, from Mikel 666. I'm a 21-year-old guy from Denmark. Back in 2017, I was going on a road trip vacation in the United States. We started off in Las Vegas, where my mom was visiting an old woman she lived with for a year back when she was 16 and an exchange student. We then drove to LA, then Arizona, followed by New Mexico, Texas, and finally Louisiana. I am and I was very into scary stuff. I was especially into cryptids and unexplained creatures, which I was teased for by my sister and her boyfriend. When we were driving through the deserts of Arizona, my dad had to have a smoke, and we needed to stretch our legs. We got out of the car, and my dad began smoking. We looked around, trying to pass the time. Out of nowhere, my sister speaks up. "What is that?" and pointed toward the desert, where we immediately noticed a lion-sized, totally black cat. And I'm not talking like a normal black panther. This creature was so dark and black, it seemed to absorb the light around it, like a shadow. It was just walking. It had a really long and thick tail, and it walked so freaking weird, like it was a robot. Just totally stiff legs. It noticed us watching it, and froze for a moment, before turning its head really fast and staring at us. It turned its body then without moving its head, and started walking in our direction. I said to everybody that we should probably get back in the car and get moving. I wasn't going to stay around for that thing to reach us. My family quickly agreed, so we hurried to get back in the car to take off. For the rest of the trip, my sister's boyfriend and my sister didn't tease me about unexplainable creatures anymore. We were really creeped out by this thing. During the ride, I started to Google some things about animals that lived in Arizona, and I couldn't find anything about huge felines that are solid black living anywhere around here, let alone any animal that looked exactly like that anywhere in the world. I still think about this a lot to this very day, and I've never found an answer to what it was out there. What could it be? This creature, as large as a lion, blacker than black, with an overly long and thick tail. You tell me. Theater Creature, from Texas. This story happened to me and a friend of mine back in our sophomore year of high school, which was 9 years ago. We lived in a small town in West Texas of about 1,500 people. The town used to have some small amenities, like a rec center, auto parts store, and a movie theater. All have now been shut down and are slowly falling apart. As kids, we would go into the old movie theater through either the door out back or the rooftop entrance from the ladder to the side. The back door went straight into a big room full of costumes that is behind the stage of the theater. Movies were played as well as acts that must have been done before I was born, knowing the theater was only open for a very short period after I'd moved into town. I've never had any strange occurrences during the few times I'd been there, until that day in particular. After that, I stopped going back to the theater entirely. Me and my friend had gone through the rooftop entrance and made our way to the overhead balcony, overlooking the stage and rows of chairs. The chairs that led down from where we were went to the lobby area, where you could buy tickets before entering the theater. The stairs were full from top to bottom of old glassware like cups and plates. We used to take a box or two up to the top balcony and throw them across the theater, listening to them break. Don't worry, this place had long been abandoned. No one was coming back for any of this stuff. The only light source in that place was whatever flashlights we had brought. Otherwise, it was pitch black in there. That day, as we threw the plates and cups across the theater, hearing them break and shatter, we had heard something else across the theater by the stage. Knowing it's a small town, we chalked it up to raccoons or a cat that may have made this place its home, so we shined the light. But we didn't see anything out of the ordinary. We continued to throw the plates, and we heard the noise again. This time it was a bit louder. We shined the light once more, scanning our way up to the stage, where we were mortified to see 3 strange creatures. Even now, I've got no explanation for what they were. In the face, they looked like human women, with rough-looking hair down to their shoulders. They were crouched over on the stage, with wings protruding from their backs. In the light, their skin was gray. Our flashlight beam gave us away immediately. They started to scream this high-pitched squeal and proceeded to stand up. We immediately took off to the ladder, heading back up to the roof entrance. We weren't followed, but it was enough to make me stay out of there to this day. Many people in our town claim to be followed at night by strange creatures called lechuzas, or witchbird. I've never seen the creatures again and hope I never do. It doesn't make me fear cryptids. I just don't want to be put in that position of being outnumbered by something I couldn't explain, let alone could only see with a flashlight beam. The Noise, from Kelby L. This happened to me and my friend Corey. We both live in southern Ohio. We one day decided to go into the woods with a BB gun to try to shoot some stuff. We were just a couple of bored kids, 12 or 13 years old. We walked into the woods about half a mile or so, enjoying each other's company, joking around like friends do. At one point, we stopped to take a break, sitting down on a big log. We were talking about video games, girls, and whatnot, when we began to hear something walking around. We look around and see nothing there, but the walking kept on going, until it stopped like whatever was walking was surprised to see us, which freaked us out because we couldn't see it or them. This was in autumn. There were no leaves or vegetation on anything, so we could see about 100 yards in any direction. Yet still, we could not see what was making the walking sound. I grabbed a stick and threw it, just to make some noise to see what the thing would do. It then began making these small jumping sounds, like a squirrel or something. Still, we couldn't see it. Right when we were about to ignore it, or forget it, this ungodly roar, and I mean roar, came bellowing out at us. It was so loud and deep, it rattled my chest. I could feel it deep within my bones. Each roar lasted a good few seconds. We jumped up immediately and began scanning the area, shaking like crazy, but still not seeing anything. This creature kept coming though, roaring and roaring at us so loud and deep, it felt like it was messing with my heartbeat. My friend and I looked at each other and ran. Whatever it was, I don't think a BB gun was going to do much to it. We ran all the way back half a mile to the safety of the electric fence. The entire time, we could hear it following us. Though the roar grew louder and the creature drew closer, we never saw hide nor hair of it. Luckily, we made it home just fine. We talk about this crazy experience from time to time. We joke about one day going back in the woods with a lot more weapons and finding that creature that made the sound. But truthfully, I'm too scared to do that. I've only been in the woods maybe 2 or 3 times since then, and because of this experience, I always felt watched and creeped out. That's my story of the roaring thing that sounded like it was right in our face, yet could not be seen. Nowadays, I regret never looking up in the trees. That's the only place I didn't think to look. I was chased by a skinwalker. From That One Texan. This happened when I was 12. My best friend and I had incredibly active imaginations, and the woods behind his house were the perfect playground. His family owned 3 acres of land in Decatur, Texas, and his house sat on the very front of their property. Their backyard had a creek and a deep drainage ditch running through it. The ditch was perpendicular to the creek. The creek itself made a 90-degree turn into their yard, pointing away from the house, and a 15-foot cliff overlooked the bend. And let's call my friend Joe for anonymity's sake. Joe and I would play in the ditch, rain or shine, with his airsoft rifles, pretending to be World War I soldiers, Indiana Jones, or space troopers conquering an alien world. We would follow the creek back into their property, deep into the woods. Joe's parents never had an issue with this because we knew the woods like the back of our hands, and Joe had a walkie-talkie he used to talk to his parents. We would play in the woods all the way to the barbed wire fence that served as the property line. Those woods were basically our second home, and we would camp in them almost every time I would spend the night. One summer day, I was having a sleepover at Joe's house, and we were planning on camping in the woods. We were super excited for the night, because Joe's parents were letting us set up our tent across the creek back in the tree line. We were never allowed to do this before, because there were bobcats and coyotes in the woods, and his parents were afraid that we could get ourselves hurt. This day in particular was mild for a Texas summer day, and we spent the whole day outside, playing in the woods. We had eaten dinner and got our tent set up and ready to go, but we still had a couple of hours left of sunlight. We planned on spending them all in the woods playing. Around 8:45 p.m., the sun began to set, and soon we were back at the property line. We decided to head back then. It usually took us about 15 minutes to walk back to the creek, but we took far longer than that because we had never been in the woods at night before. Before long, it was dark out, and we began to realize our mistake. We stumbled through the woods, tripping over tree roots, our airsoft rifles, and thorn bushes. We were about 100 yards from the tent and crossing the creek when we heard a sound. We stopped in the water, listening closely. The only sounds were crickets chirping, frogs croaking, and water trickling over stones. I suddenly realized I was shivering, even though it was still 90 degrees out and incredibly humid. Something just felt off, and I couldn't put my finger on it. As Joe and I began walking towards the shore on the other side of the creek, we heard a scream. I started shivering again, and Joe stared at me. We knew what bobcat screams sounded like, but this sound was like nothing else we had ever heard before. It was both high-pitched and deep, and throaty at the same time, but the worst part was that it was close, very close. Joe looked at me and said, "I'm scared. Let's run to the tent. I can see it over there." I nodded, and we started to sprint through the dark woods. As we were breaking through a bush, we heard something big splashing in the creek, and another blood-curdling scream cutting through the still night air. The sound startled me, and I lost my footing on a tree root. I crashed to the ground, smacking my shin on a rock. Joe kept running, not realizing that I'd fallen. I sat up and saw something that I'll never forget. A dog was looking at me through a bush. At first, I thought it was a coyote, until I saw that its eyes were bright yellow, and it was the size of a small horse. I began to crawl backwards, keeping eye contact with the beast the whole time. I stared into those bright, intelligent eyes, and I could tell that it was amused by my show of fear. I slowly stood up and kept backing away, absolutely terrified. The creature chuffed, turned around, and disappeared into the brush. I immediately turned and sprinted to the tent, scared to my very core. Joe and I sat in the tent and sobbed for close to an hour before working up the courage to run 50 yards up the hill to his house. I don't know how, but we fell asleep that night, and I remember getting up to get a glass of water, hearing that haunting scream again. Joe still lives in that house, and every once in a while he hears strange sounds and sees strange things. A few months ago, he and his father found a dead buck in the creek. It had been shredded, and there's no way a cougar or a coyote pack did it. The poor thing had been torn apart. The most disturbing part of the spectacle was that something had taken a massive bite out of the deer's chest, devouring the heart. Every time I go back into those woods, I get chills, and Joe and I always triple check that all the doors and windows are locked before going to sleep. That wasn't the last time I had a run-in with the skinwalker, but I'll have to share that another time. I truly hope that you never have to experience what I did that night in the woods. Backpacking in Wyoming, from Alexandria. When I was around 23, my good friend and I went backpacking near the South Platte River in Wyoming. As most people know, the wilderness is no place for an inexperienced hiker like myself, so my friend came along armed with a handgun big enough to hurt any creepy people lurking in the wilderness or any random bears. So then we hit some back roads and dirt trails. We ended up stopping at a camping spot that hunters would use. There were signs like meat poles and such. We park and look around for any old deer tracks, and we find tracks leading to a hollow just a few yards away. We give each other a glance and grab our bags for the walk ahead. Soon we find ourselves in the brush, and I'm worried about ticks when we hear howls, and I glance up to notice a now very still friend. Before I could say another word, the air around me is filled with this pungent smell of elk. To me, it was like heavy pee mixed with a sappy, muddy smell. Then the sounds around us erupted into a symphony of breaking trees, which nearly sounded like thunder. My friend suddenly pushes me into the brush. Apparently, we had unknowingly walked into a herd of elk. One of the elk, a female, came right at us. My friend fired his gun in a panic, missing the elk. But once it broke through the brush, the elk ran right past us. But there was something weirdly wrong with it. I'm not sure if my friend fainted or may have hit his head, but he was blacked out. I did my best to drag my unconscious friend up the hill to safety. On top of the hill, I got a good look at the elk down below. They were all standing motionless and staring at us through the trees. This was a bit unsettling. My friend woke up pretty quickly, especially after a splash of water I had. "You alright?" I couldn't take my eyes off of the elk while I asked him this. I was afraid that if I did and I looked back, I wouldn't be able to see them anymore. "Yeah, wait, where are we? Did you see that man?" His voice stammered, and then his eyes looked toward the elk below. I looked at his face, then slowly back to the elk. They all seemed taller than normal, almost hidden in the trees. The air felt wrong too, sickly almost. You could smell rotten meat, and it made me yak from that pungent smell. I remembered that smell from before. "We need to leave." His voice was short. I helped him up, and we headed out of the brush, but we stopped when we heard the pained huff of an elk behind us. My friend insisted that I do not turn around. Instead, the two of us tried our best to run. But as we started to run, I grew curious, too curious, and I turned around for a look. It was the same female. Her hair looked like it was all mangy, and her skin and fur seemed to be falling or melting off. There were holes in her ribs where you could see bones. It huffed again, but the huff sounded like a scream. I turned to take off running, but my friend was nowhere to be seen now. I broke through the brush and came down hard on my knees, having fallen to the ground. My eyes were burning in the back of my skull, but then I heard a voice coming from the direction of the elk. It sounded close, and I could smell that same rot coming from it.
Child, don't fear.
I didn't dare turn around. I did not want to know what was speaking those words. "Alex!" someone called out. I opened my eyes and a truck flew in front of me. Soon after, another scream came from behind me. I turned to see the elk again, and behind it were red eyes in the bushes. The other supposed elk. I heard voices, multiple voices from every direction now, all saying the same thing.
Stay.
The truck door opened suddenly. My friend grabbed me by the shoulder and basically threw me in the truck. We tore out of that place, but the images, the sounds we experienced there, they still haunt me very much as they confuse me. Those red eyes, those horrible, tortured faces of the elk. Remember when my friend asked me if I saw that man? Well, I later figured out what he was talking about. After he saw the female elk coming at us, he apparently saw a tall, horrid-looking man. He said that his face was gruesome. Flesh from his face was falling off. Eyes were bulging out of their sockets, eyes that looked to be dipped into a fiery red. And turns out he had fainted. After seeing the man, he blacked out and had dreams of these elk devouring me at the spot where I'd tripped, tearing me to shreds, and then feasting on each other. He said he could hear a chant like song. We still hike, and I do have my own gun now to protect me. But just in case, I've got some backup holy water, if I can reach it in time. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. There are plenty more coming up. If you have a story that you'd like to have narrated on the show, share it with us at darkstories.org. Check the links below if you'd like to support the show. And until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're great people. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.